From the cockpit, the ocean is a grid you can command until the sky tears open. We roll to cover the torpedo bombers below, confident, practiced, sure of the pattern, and then the pattern breaks. Sirens on the flagship deck cruise frozen among fuel hoses and bomb carts, a dark V of American dive bombers knifing down out of a sun we thought we owned. Doctrine says, turn, climb, recover the umbrella. Time refuses. One hit, then two orange blossoms where flight decks used to be. Headsets fill with clipped syllables that don't finish. The fleet is still moving. Our certainty isn't. Late May 1942. Combined fleet at sea. Confidence has a ritual. Briefings conclude with neat arrows. The staff pointer taps Midway bait to draw out the crippled American carriers. Kido Butai has not lost. Pearl Harbor proved speed and surprise can reorder empires. Aircrews are veterans who land by feel, armorers who balance bombs by sound, deck gangs who can turn a strike package like clockwork. The perimeter expands. Rabaul secured the Aleutians within reach. Logistics are tight but precise. Oilers rendezvous on time, aviation gasoline measured to the drum. Our Zero still dances lighter than anything the Americans fly. Intelligence estimates say Yorktown is wrecked. Enterprise and Hornet tired their pilots green. Radio traffic patterns, what we can hear, fit expectations. The decisive battle doctrine promises that one more clean blow will fix the Americans in place for a negotiated future. The calendar is our ally, 6 months of freedom to fortify mine straits, make the ocean a wall. We rehearse launches in darkness, refine the scout plan, brief alternate targets with calm voices. The weather looks merciful. The Emperor's portrait watches over the chart. If the enemy comes, he comes thin, late, and clumsy. If he does not, we take the island and shorten the war. Either way, the board favors us. We had a file of American weaknesses, and it felt thick in the hand. The first page said their courage was sporadic, but their doctrine was timid. Pilots ordered to preserve machines rather than press a kill. The second page said their gunnery was wasteful. They fired in great clattering storms and hit little a culture of volume over precision. We repeated these sentences until they hardened into law. Their fighters helped the illusion. The F4F looked slab-sided and stubborn, a bulldog, without the speed or climb to dance with a Zero. Our instructors sketched its turn circle on the chalkboard and let the room laugh. Never fight them slow, good, because we fight slow by choice. The Wildcat's only answer, we thought, was to tuck its tail and dive away, an admission in metal that our hands were the finer ones on the stick. If the enemy's best trick was to run, then surely the initiative belonged to us. Their torpedo planes. Even our junior officers smirked. The Devastator was a misnamed antique, a fabric and rivet lesson in how not to bring a torpedo to a modern war. It waddled down the throat of an alert fleet at speeds our gunners could count aloud. Doctrine said a balanced strike, dive bombers from above, torpedo planes from below, was the proper hammer. Doctrine also said you discard tools that do not bite. The Americans seemed unwilling to admit when a tool was dull. We measured their carriers and found hope in the gaps. After Pearl Harbor, we assumed their flight decks were crippled, their repair yards confused their crews green, and therefore careful, the worst sin at sea. Careful decks move slow. Slow decks miss windows. Missed windows cost a fleet its sting. We told ourselves their maintenance culture, so proud in peacetime, would hurt them under pressure. Checklists piled upon checklists, signatures demanded a worship of procedure that leaks minutes away. Our aviation officers swore by tempo. Theirs, we believed, swore by paperwork. Even their geography looked like a flaw. A continental nation must stretch every gallon of fuel and every spare across an ocean that does not forgive. We rehearsed intercepts at ranges they would struggle to sustain. Oilers are targets. Targets frighten planners. Frightened planners hesitate. We had built our striking arm around speed and concentration. They would be forced to spread to feed many fires, and a scattered enemy is a friendly sea. Intelligence readouts. What we could read seemed to confirm it. Their radio discipline was clumsy, the rhythms inconsistent, the call signs occasionally naive. It sounded like a band tuning rather than a symphony. Our scouts, we believed, would find them first. Our scouts would name the time and place, and we would open the sky. There was also beneath the ink and arithmetic an attitude that felt like truth because it felt good. Americans were indulgent soft airfields and soft food and soft hands that knew the price of milk better than the price of blood. We equated industry with softness, quantity, with cowardice, comfort, with incompetence. We mistook a nation's conveniences for its character. Mockery is a narcotic you dose yourself and the world briefly comes into sharper, simpler focus. So we smiled at the thought of their green replacement pilots, imagined them fumbling flares and floating high on landing approaches, pictured their deck crews counting spanners while we counted kills. We built an ambush around the certainty that they would arrive late, awkward, underarmed, badly coordinated. And if they did not arrive, even better. Midway would be an island with a rising sun, and the war's 6th month would prove the first month of America's long goodbye. Silence has weight at sea. Before dawn it sits on the shoulders like a wet coat. The wakes glow dull green, the bow writes cursive into a black page, and the fleet speaks in metal chain, kissing hawse ailerons twitching against gusts, catwalk grates ticking as they cool. We are ready, which is to say, we are waiting. Waiting sharpens everything. Coffee is hot enough to burn a tongue already bitten raw by briefings. A boatswain's whisper travels farther than a shout. On the hangar deck, fuel hoses coil like sleeping snakes beside the bomb carts, each wheel chalked in a line that satisfies the eye. Ordnance men murmur the same words they spoke yesterday and the day before, safeties, lugs, fuses, weights, litany as shield. The deck gang runs hands over tie-downs they do not need to check again. Routine is how sailors hold fear at arm's length. Our scouts lift first pale slashes of noise tearing up the darkness, wingtip lights. Hooded pilots squinting into the east. They disappear into a bowl of cloud, and the carrier breathes out lighter by degrees. In the ready room, flight leaders watch the clock and pretend to watch the chalkboard. The plan's simple geometry search arcs converge, points strike waves, sits beautiful and still. Beauty lies. Below, a petty officer unlocks the armory and finds he cannot remember the second digit of the last combination he spun. Above, a lookout rubs frost off binocular lenses with a sleeve he shouldn't use, then does it anyway. These are not omens. They are human. Even in a fleet that has never lost men, feel the arithmetic of chance. Radio silence is a doctrine we love because it makes us feel like hunters. We imagine the enemy clogged with chatter, the American habit of talking to solve problems, betraying positions and plans. We picture their carriers smoking from rushed repairs. Their screws misaligned, their flight decks scarred in ways you can't see until you ask them to move quickly. In the dark, we repeat these comforts, and they almost sound like facts. And yet the ocean answers to no briefing. A deck officer glances at the windsock and recalculates launch headings. A signalman traces cloud shoulders and wonders if they will trap returning planes. Somewhere to starboard, a destroyer's boiler quivers wrong, and the engineer lets it settle rather than wake the captain. Small frictions collect in a war the plan insists is smooth. The problem we do not name out loud is simple decisive battle requires decisive timing, and timing requires certainty, and certainty cannot be ordered from a chart. We will not know if the scouts have missed a shadow until a shadow becomes a strike. We will not know if our torpedo bombers will meet flak at the perfect crossing angle until the angle appears. We will not know if the enemy is green or merely quiet until his first dive traces a white thread down the canvas of the sky. So we wait. The Emperor's portrait watches from the bulkhead. The navigator's pencil makes small islands out of large water. The chaplain's hands fold and unfold with the rhythm of the ship. A young airman, too young for his mustache to matter, twirls a lucky coin and catches it twice, then pockets it, as if hiding a superstition can make it stronger. Then the first report crackles nothing grand, just a bearing and a distance, a possibility with a question mark. Heads lift. Headsets press tighter. The silence changes key. Somewhere far beyond the rim of vision, someone else has been waiting too, measuring wind, rehearsing checklists, making a different set of mistakes. The horizon is a lid. The day will open it. And when it opens, all our careful quiet must turn in one motion into noise. Shift the lens. The camera leaves the quiet corridors of the combined fleet, and rides a night train of decisions, rushing east from code rooms in Hawaii to welders under arc light in Pearl, from deck handlers drilling in the dark to pilots learning to think in formations rather than duels. Preparation, in the American style, is not a single genius at a single table. It is a chorus that begins offstage and swells until the curtains shake. On Ford Island, a carrier lies open like a patient ribs, showing Yorktown hit hard at Coral Sea, and supposed by our arithmetic to be a non-factor. Shipfitters measure not in days, but in shifts. They eat standing sparks in their hair, and when the plate cools enough to touch a rivet, gun starts before anyone speaks. Damaged bulkheads get doubler plates. Ruptured steam lines get a split sleeve and clamps. A torpedo blister is fared where it only needs to be flat. The doctrine is simple: make her watertight, make her fight. Perfection is a peacetime vice. Across the channel, the airfields hum. Ground crews write checklists, the way priests write prayers, methodical, devout, and then they cut the liturgy in half because speed is a virtue now. Fuel trucks run hot laps. Bomb dumps breathe out crates. Armorers pass 500-pounders hand to hand like a bucket brigade. Engines cough, settle, sing. Pilots walk the line with faces that look young until the light hits their eyes. They rehearse with hands, flak break, weave, rendezvous, pushover, until the muscle knows before the mind does. Elsewhere, rooms without windows wrestle with words. AF, water shortage. A message seeded like bait, and then caught on the enemy net. Midway asks for fresh water. The Americans smile without showing teeth. Men in shirt sleeves, cigarettes parked on ashtrays, pencils tapping to a rhythm only they hear turn fragments into calendar marks. When how many from which bearing? The answers do not arrive as thunderclaps. They accumulate like filings pulled toward a magnet until the shape cannot be anything else. At sea, Enterprise and Hornet practice the art that defeats diagrams the deck cycle. Launch fighters to watch. Launch scouts to find. Launch the strike without waiting for the last scrap of certainty, because certainty is a luxury. The strike leader stands on the island palm flat on the rail and measures wind by feel. He needs every knot. Below crews chalk grease pencil run-ups on the deck, planks swinging planes forward in a clattering ballet of brakes, chocks, and hand signals. The choreography is not elegant. It is efficient, and efficiency multiplied becomes elegance. The impossible idea is not a stunt. This time no twin-engine bombers balanced on a carrier's deck, though that audacity 4 months earlier has rewired what the Americans think is allowed. The idea now is brutally simple: arrive first in the vertical dimension with enough disciplined violence that the enemy cannot reset the board. Accept losses where loss buys position. Protect the dive bombers with time rather than with planes if you cannot spare the planes. Force a timing problem the other side cannot solve. This is not the war of nights our opponents imagined. It is a scheduling war disguised as thunder. A logistics officer on a destroyer tender tweaks the oiler rendezvous by an hour and buys the task force 10 more knots for the morning sprint. A yeoman in a code shack updates a probability board and pushes a commander across his own doubt. A chief on the hangar deck decides to pre-stage bombs 2 at a time instead of 4 because the hoist jams when rushed. The sum of small mercies is momentum. When dawn bleaches the horizon, the American machine is already in motion, radars turning, signal flags popping, TBS murmuring in clipped code, coffee cooling untouched. The genius here is distributed the shipyard pace that defies repair manuals. The code breakers wager on AF. The flight instructors who taught dive angles as if they were catechism. The captains willing to let the plan be imperfect if the timing can be perfect. It looks like chaos from a distance. Up close, it is 1,000 hands catching the same rope and pulling the future into reach. You hear it before you see it, the carrier breathing. Air moves across the flight deck in long, invisible slabs. The ship leans a fraction into wind it cannot touch, and the island chatters with orders compressed to nouns and numbers. Then the deck becomes a diagram scribbled in motion. Tail up, chalks out, thumbs up, go. A wildcat wobbles, bites, and lifts. Another follows so close the wake of one wingtip would shave paint from the next. Cap is a necklace around the task force sections at Angels 10, 12, 14, rotating like gears. Above Midway itself, Marine fighters slash in and out of flak puffs stitches in a fabric that never quite holds. Scouts fan wide SBDs with bellies heavy and eyes sharper than glass crews, counting miles by fuel gauges and cloud edges. One voice calls a contact that might be a phantom. Another voice calmer repeats a bearing with the kind of boredom that sounds like truth. The strike leader makes the hard choice, quickly launch the torpedo planes low, and now to force the enemy to raise his shield at the wrong height. Hold the dive bombers for the angle that kills. The devastators go first. Engines drag at the props as if the ocean pulls back. Wings rattle. Cockpits are hot enough to cook the doubt out of a man. They fly level and steady, because that is what their ordnance demands, and in doing so they draw the enemy's fighters down like iron filings to a magnet. It is not heroism alone, it is geometry. If the interceptors chase the low and slow, they cannot be high and fast when it matters. On the decks below, 5-inch mounts speak in hard syllables, 25mm guns stitch, and tracer webs try to pin the threat to a plane the gun crews can understand. Altitude, meanwhile, stacks like a promise. The dive bombers arrive late by the clock, and exactly on time by the only metric that matters, the enemy's deck state. Down there, flight leaders have just waved in, returning cap hangars are busy with fuel lines, and hoists and ordnance men are mid-swap between torpedoes and bombs. Confusion makes a sound, a rising directionless cry across 4 carriers at once. Then the first dauntless tips. Dive is a prayer you shout with your hands, speed brakes, nose straight, aim just ahead of the island. If the wind holds, save nothing for the go-around, because there will not be one. The airframe howls. The bomb tumbles free with a shrug you feel through the seat of your spine. Pull. G-load hammers the breath into the small of your back. Above and behind, blossoms of fire detonate in slow motion, then race to catch up with sound. Akagi takes it. Amidships. Kaga's deck becomes splinters and deck edge lift. Soryu coughs flame through seams not designed to carry it. Somewhere Hiryu turns to bite back, and the Americans will pay for that. But the ratio has changed. Ratios decide wars. Surface gunnery is not the star, but it writes its name on the day. Destroyers throw up walls of bursts that make angles awkward. Cruisers put disciplined ladders of flak between incoming and target. The carrier's own 5-inch guns slave to directors add punctuation. Yet the secret is not volume. It is timing the way cap windows overlap, the way the first wave creates the wrong answer key, the way the second wave arrives when the test has been rewritten. The Americans do not attack as heroes in search of duels. They attack as a schedule looking for a bottleneck. Waves do not stop because narrative wants breath. A second push angles in before damage control parties can finish their first coherent thought. A third, shove later vengeful, finds Hiryu exposed and breaks the last intact sword. Between waves, the task force resets, recover, refuel, rearm, relaunch. Deck crews run their racetrack with wands and whistles. Hose handlers snap drain cap. Loaders muscle fresh bombs across steel too hot to touch with bare palms. The pace is inhuman, which is to say, human multiplied. Over Midway proper, the island's batteries add a ground chorus, 3-inch and 5-inch bursts, marking the sky like chalk radar scopes, sweeping spotters calling altitude, and angels like auctioneers. Every weapon from a Marine's 50 vas on a sandbagged revetment to a carrier's flight deck crane hauling wreckage overboard plays its bar in the composition. The enemy feels attacked by numbers. What he is really attacked by is sequence. When the day finally yawns toward dusk, the arithmetic is carved into water. Aircraft expended and aircraft recovered. Decks intact and decks mortally wounded. Shouting and captains whispering. The scale was not a myth. Hundreds of sorties spun out of a handful of flight decks in cycles so tight they squealed. But scale alone would have failed if not arranged into a pattern the other side could not solve in time. That pattern, the sauce no manual names, was simple to say, and hard to do. Find first enough fix, long enough, and finish together. June 4th, 1942. Midway. The first noise is not gunfire, but the tearing of discipline. A lookout's voice pitched half an octave too high, bearings colliding in the headphones, a semaphore flag that lifts, trembles, and drops, as if the arm holding it has forgotten the alphabet. Orders move through the fleet like warm oil, thick, delayed, smearing intentions. We were ready, which meant we were rehearsed. Suddenly, rehearsal is a lie that doesn't fit the stage. On the flagship, the air plot looks like a garden trampled by panic. Arrows cross where they should never meet. Chalk dust floats in the beam of the overhead lamp as if even light has been shaken loose. Staff officers speak in fragments. "Recover, Cap, no wave off, rearm for." The sentence ends in the throat because the deck officer's phone rings with a word nobody wants incoming. The first American shape we can attach a number to is low and stubborn torpedo planes. Devastators. Misnamed, we have joked, and the joke will not die in our mouths. They come on a course that insults geometry level, and slow as if dueling with an idea rather than a navy. Our Zeros drop obediently glorious in their element and cut long, bright wounds into the sky. It should be clean. It is not. Kill after kill, and still the string of attackers does not break. It stretches. They pull us downward, pull us outward, pull us off time. On Kaga's deck, a handler trips on a hose that should have been stowed 5 minutes ago. On Soryu, an ordnance man locks eyes with a friend just long enough to share the knowledge that the safety he forgot to remove is now a blessing. The island loudspeakers lose grammar and become shouts, "Stand by, clear, no, not that." The aircraft elevators ride up with the wrong mix of steel and flesh fuel drums on dollies beside wing routes, beside bomb carts. A petty officer who has never cursed in front of an officer curses like a priest burning a ruined sermon. Flak writes its own ancient language, rings and ladders bursts that mark where fear thinks the enemy will be. Our 5-inch mounts boom in patient patterns. The 25mm stutter like teeth chattering. Tracers walk across the ocean striving to catch a moving truth. Our captains turn into and away from torpedoes on instinct so rehearsed it looks like prophecy. Wakes combed, spreads defeated. Another squadron of devastators rolls in and leaves a necklace of blossoms in the water where our hulls used to be. The ocean accepts their gifts and gives back only steam. Command is supposed to be a pyramid. This morning, it is a staircase with missing steps. The flagship signals a recovery for Cape that needs fuel. The fighter directors veto because the horizon is dirty with more low shapes. The strike officer screams for a clean deck to launch our own hammer. Every answer is the right answer, and therefore none is. We are flying at the ground level of a plan designed to be seen from God's height. Down here, the lines tangle. Voices that never rise, rise. Men who never run, run. On Akagi, a damage control party drills a hatch shut so fast they catch a man's sleeve, and the man chooses to leave part of his uniform behind rather than waste the second it would take to argue for the arm. On Kaga, a firefighting hose kicks free and writes a snake of gasoline across the deck that someone will mistake for water, until it ignites in color, too bright to be believed. The smell raw fuel paint cordite hot metal crowds the senses until memory itself smells like it. Our cap, pulled down and outward by the torpedo planes, never quite returns to the altitude where doctrine lives. We call for them, and the sky answers with the buzz of engines someplace else. Intervals that should stitch into a canopy over the fleet become holes through which fate peers. A radio operator who would rather be flogged than speak out of turn breaks discipline to say simply, "Where is the umbrella?" No one answers because answering would be confession. We do hurt them. Devastators dissolve into confetti under cannon, and the pilots die cleanly or badly, but they die. A wildcat falls burning, and a cheer rises that sounds like an apology to no one. We throw weight and skill at the problem, because weight and skill have always been enough. For a moment, one long stolen moment, it seems to work. The last of the torpedo wakes lie harmless. In our wash, our decks are finally pointed the same way, and the fighter directors begin to rebuild their altitude chart like men stacking stones after an earthquake. Then the sun tears. That is what it feels like, a rent in the upper light. Shadows sharpen into angles with intent. Dauntlesses flaring, speed breaks, noses steady, the polite, terrible patience of a predator that has found the right distance. The flagship's voice orders a turn that the helmsman is already making. Kaga begins her own desperate swing. Soryu bellies into a course that should present less deck to the fall. Hard over is a phrase too slow for the human mouth. The first hits are not sounds but changes in the deck's personality. The spring goes out from under your boots. The island shakes on a frequency that feels like anger. Then the noise arrives like a late verdict. Splinters become weapons, then ash. A Zero returning from chase tries to wave off and collides with a deck-edge crane that should not have been there, that would not have been there if time had obeyed. A 1,000-page manual on ammunition handling burns down to a single instruction: throw it overboard. Here you lives whole in this moment and proves a kind of vengeance, launching strikes that find and hurt an American carrier, proof that our sword still has an edge. On her deck, the old pace lives another hour. Chalk's thumbs launch smooth as habit. The rest of us do not live in habit anymore. We live inside a sentence with too many clauses and no period. A staff captain orders the same thing twice and gets a different outcome each time. Lines that should carry water carry flame. Bomb carts that should be empty become altars for heat to worship. The trial by fire is literal. Bulkheads pop rivets like teeth. Deck paint bubbles into strange topographies. Ordnance goes sympathetic, a careful word for a careless catastrophe. In the ready room, chairs bolt to the deck, keep their posture, while the men who sat in them have already left to become another story. We drag hoses, move wounded, pitch wreckage, pray in languages we did not know we knew. The hierarchy that held us upright becomes an argument, then a suggestion, then a rumor. And still we try to knit control back together. A surviving fighter leader pulls what he can to a new altitude, a patch of canopy small as a hand. A cruiser captain edges his ship into a flak position he was never meant to occupy. And for 5 minutes, his gunners are the only geometry that makes sense. A destroyer slides along a carrier's burning flank and pours water with a devotion that feels like treason to fear. Commanders shout through speaking tubes that now speak heat more fluently than words. The battle does not end. It accelerates away from us until we are chasing our own past competence. We were trained to love decisive battle. Instead, we meet decisive timing. It belongs to someone else. The day keeps writing. We keep reading aloud letters that no longer form words. Somewhere unreachable by phone or flag, the plot has shifted hands. The mind tries to turn defeat into a puzzle with an elegant answer. We search for a single mistake to salute with blame, a scout that sighted late, a signal miscopied, a deck crew that rearmed in the wrong sequence. We list them and feel the comfort of specificity, as if a changed digit would rewind the film. But realization is larger. It arrives in pieces that refuse to assemble into a single villain. Piece 1, noise that does not stop. Waves, plural. You beat down the low attackers and the sky remains busy. You cut at the next wave and a third arrives at an angle that turns your practiced evasions into theater. A machine that launches and recovers and relaunches is, without the pauses we were taught to expect, is not fighting us, it is erasing us by iteration. Piece 2, damage that reproduces. A fire on a Japanese carrier is supposed to be a duel between steel and water, with men as seconds. Today, fire breeds in the seams, skips underplating, finds the places we kept fuel for speed, and makes speed an accelerant. While we fight one blaze, another is already practicing our names. We discover that our excellence, tight deck cycles, concentrated hangar work, has a second life as vulnerability when timing is taken from us. The Americans did not have to be perfect. They only had to be on time. Piece 3. The sound of youth and numbers. Over the radio net that still functions, you hear English spoken in many voices, calm, nasal, hurried, clipped, and the content feels less like orders than like agreements. We'll take the north pair. Copy rolling in. Save your fuel for the egress. It is not poetry. It is a factory floor that has learned to fly. When their first squadron is bent, a second steps into its outline with no visible ceremony. When a leader goes silent, a wingman's voice tightens, and the formation turns as if the new geometry were baked into them at birth. We brought priceless crews to this day. They brought a pipeline. Piece 4, the realization that our map is wrong. We drew a perimeter to be guarded by limited doors. They arrive as if the ocean were a road with many lanes. Oilers rendezvous where we did not expect. Repair yards achieve in hours what our estimates said took weeks. An island's radio trick about fresh water becomes a blade that slips under our armor of assumption. Intelligence is not an officer with a file. It is an organism. We feel the pivot not in grand speeches, but in small gestures. A bosun's mate who has never misjudged a heaving line throws and misses because the deck under him has acquired a limp. A staff officer, face gray with smoke, folds his map along a crease that never existed and stares at the wrong-sized rectangle as if paper can shrink time. A pilot returns with holes in places that should not have holes and looks surprised to find that flying was possible at all. Surprise is the new grammar. After noon, the battle adjusts into ledger lines. Our last intact carrier throws her punches with dignity and pain, drawing blood, because our doctrine still teaches hands to be clever even when the head cannot plan. We hear that an American carrier is hurt, proof that nothing is singular in war. Then the ledger restores its asymmetry. Another American wave, another reset we cannot mirror. Our fighters climb and find nothing, because the enemy has already passed through that altitude and left his shadow as decoy. The feeling is of running toward a door that keeps moving. Somewhere below, damage control does heroism with buckets and pumps with wet canvas and faith. Men tie themselves to hoses so that recoil won't throw them off the deck. A chaplain hands out water and last rites with the same motion and no hierarchy. A surgeon works bare-chested and black with soot stitching in a corridor that remembers being a corridor. We will tell these stories later, and they will be true. They will not change the arithmetic. Arithmetic 4, fleet carriers at dawn, 2 crippled by noon, 1 knocking at the enemy's teeth before being silenced, 1 dying slowly enough to teach lessons that arrive too late to be useful. Arithmetic aircrews burned that cannot be reborn by order. Deck gangs who knew how to turn a strike in a storm and now know how to die in order. Arithmetic, an opponent who spends aircraft like a nation, spends breath and still sounds ready to speak the next sentence. In the quiet, that is not quiet, the pauses between explosions, the moments when the deck merely smokes instead of flames, you hear other sounds. Hammers. Not the frantic banging of fear, but the workman's rhythm of salvage and preparation on ships that are not sinking. Americans putting back together what our morning broke. The sound of a war that does not depend on this minute because the next 20 minutes will also be theirs. Realization hardens we have brought swords to a factory. We grew up on the word decisive, and we believed it lived in a single day, detectable by historians and poets. The enemy has chosen a different God. Sufficient information, sufficient repair, sufficient pilots, sufficient patience to trade blood for position as long as position becomes production. We understand that now not as philosophy, but as temperature on the skin. When the order to scuttle comes for ships that were cities at dawn, officers do not shout it. They say it quietly, like a prayer bowing to a larger commandment. You save what you can, colors codes men who can still move, then you give steel back to the ocean and call it duty. Boats swarm with wounded and unhurt in unhelpful ratios. The sea, unromantic as ever, accepts all hands equally. As evening leans in, the sky sours from blue to ash. Plumes mark where we were. Far away, specks move, American cap lazily stitching patrols, a carrier turning upwind for the 1000th time today, a destroyer distantly cutting a V into the water, with a speed that says tomorrow will also have a schedule. Our binoculars find those shapes and then fail to turn them into hope. The final piece of realization is domestic. We imagine Tokyo reading reports in rooms that prize the aesthetic of confidence. We imagine the staff making the right noises, brave, temporary, vindicable. Then we imagine the accountant's pencil doing what pencils do, alone adding columns. You can lie to a sentence, not to a sum. Midway is a number that contains other numbers, pilots trained per month, carriers laid down per quarter, engines delivered per week, gallons moved per day. Against that, our most perfect doctrine is a beautiful letter to a future that no longer exists. Men talk in low voices on decks lit by the fire of their own ships. They are not defeated in the mouth. They are quiet in the bones. One says, "We thought a blow could stop a machine." Another says nothing because there is nothing useful left to say. We do not hate the enemy. Hate is grand and spares pride. What we feel is smaller and more exact respect with teeth, the kind that tells you you will not catch up. Night picks up the pieces it can and hides the rest. We point bows toward home or toward whatever counts as home, now leaving behind a rectangle of ocean that will be a chapter in someone else's book. The realization, at last, is not theatrical. It is an everyday sentence we will live under for the duration they can do this again tomorrow, and the day after. And the day after that, until maps change shape, not because an admiral says so, but because a factory keeps time. The map doesn't change because admirals argue better. It changes because momentum outlives memory. Midway breaks more than ships. It fractures a theory, the decisive battle geometry, that promised one clean blow could fix an ocean's politics. After June 1942, Japan still draws arrows on charts, but the arrows no longer connect to available means. The perimeter is now a spreadsheet: escort ratios, sortie rates, pilot replacement curves. In every column, the math drifts the wrong way. Carriers are capital, not just for their hulls, but for the air crews that make them sing. Midway burns irreplaceable flight leaders and deck gangs, the muscle memory of launch cycles, the instinct for recovery and weather, the quiet mastery of hangar choreography. You can lay keels, you cannot lay experience. The Americans, by contrast, widen training pipelines until green lasts for weeks, not months. Naval aviators graduate into squadrons that absorb them with procedures that make competence a default rather than a miracle. The war becomes a contest of on-ramps. Strategy bows to logistics. The oil line from the East Indies may still flow, but every ton must fight its way across submarine pickets and air ambushes. Every convoy needs escorts. Every escort is a ship not striking. Each mile steamed to feed Rabaul or Truk is a mile not spent choosing initiative. Meanwhile, the United States fights horizontally: shipyards, code rooms, foundries, training command, parallel lines that don't wait for permission from one another. Liberty hulls slide down greased ways like punctuation marks. Engine plants turn out horsepower by the acre. Radar sets migrate from lab benches to masts. Proximity fuses learn to think and then teach gunnery to see. The doctrine of decisive battle withers into a museum piece. What replaces it is attrition on a schedule, a cadence of task forces that arrive, strike, replenish, and return before the defender can reframe the problem. Aleutians, Solomons, Gilberts, Marshalls' names turn into metronome clicks. The American lesson of Midway is not that luck wins wars, it's that timing can be manufactured. Repair becomes an offensive arm. Intelligence becomes logistics in advance. Aviation fuel becomes a vote the enemy cannot veto. Inside Tokyo's ministries, the memos change tone. They still carry the grammar of confidence, honor, perseverance, inevitable victory, but the accountant's pencil scratches differently. Pilots trained per quarter, carriers commissioned per year, aircraft engines per week. The tempo across the ocean rises beyond the reach of exhortation. Every tactical success bought with bravery costs strategic time, and time is the only currency the factory accepts. The more beautifully Japan fights at the edge, the more clearly the center reveals itself as hollowing. And yet Midway's most enduring wound is psychological. The realization that the opponent has chosen to solve problems as engineers do, redundantly, iteratively, without shame, about changing methods midstream. That philosophy outlives any single admiral. It flows into the Guadalcanal grind, into the stepwise demolition of island bastions, into a carrier air wing that can be replaced like a component, while the machine keeps moving. The war that began with a pinprick to wake a sleeping giant now meets a giant that walks in shifts. The perimeter shrinks, not because a plan fails once, but because a system succeeds daily. The map follows the factory. The factory does not tire. He was not a famous man. In peacetime, he might have become a mechanic with clean fingernails and a pocket notebook of torque values. In war, he wore a pilot's cloth wings and a name that disappears into casualty lists unless you trace it with your finger. He survived Midway long enough to write, and then the writing did the surviving for him. He begins with smells, the way burned aviation fuel sweetens the back of the throat, the way hot paint turns the air into a chemical prayer. He remembers a deck that used to bounce with confidence, and then suddenly felt wooden old, as if it had decided to be a floor instead of a spring. His handwriting is neat, an engineer's script that patrols the margins and refuses drama even when the sentence describes a man running on fire. He does not blame. He catalogues. The scout that sighted late the signal that tangled the hose that coughed gasoline where it should have spat water, the decision to rearm for one target, just as fate changed its mind. He lists names with billets: ordnance man, third class, plane captain, petty officer, because roles are how sailors keep chaos from stealing people twice. Between the entries, he draws tiny diagrams: a carrier island with arrows, a bombs fall line, a deck plan speckled with X's that mean here we carried a man. The diagrams feel like apologies to physics for coming true. Midway for him is not a legend. It is a cadence, launch, chase, flame, list, abandon. He hears English voices over the radio, with an ease that bothers him in retrospect, not the words, but the rhythm, the way orders sound like agreements, the way one voice falling out of the circuit is replaced by another without apology. He notices this, not to flatter the enemy, but because he understands systems, and systems are what survived his day even when men did not. He writes about a destroyer coming alongside, couched in a strange tenderness for a ship that is not his. He remembers how its hoses arced water like white ropes into a square of yellow hate, how its deck gang shouted encouragement in a language he barely grasped and yet understood perfectly. He remembers throwing steel overboard that would have been his pride yesterday, the manual on ammunition handling the carefully labeled tool chest, because weight became guilt when flame did the counting. At the end, he does something unfashionable for a warrior he admits proportion. We were good, he writes, but they were many and ready. Not many as in numbers alone, he clarifies with a meticulous underline, many as in answers, many as in ways to reach the same effect, many as in willingness to change the plan faster than pride can object. He circles the word ready as if it were an object you could put on a scale. The final paragraph is short, perhaps because the ship that carried him home pitched and groaned and stole his ink, perhaps because some truths are heavy and prefer fewer nails. He writes, "We trained for a day that would decide the war. They built a way that would decide each day. When our ships burned, we stood alone on our knowledge. When theirs burned, there were hands behind them we could not see. We were not beaten by a fleet. We were fighting a machine." The sentence feels neither bitter nor theatrical. It is an engineer's verdict, observational, exact, and intolerant of myth. History will spend pages debating luck, heroism, signal intelligence, and dive angles. He leaves those to the talkers. He offers the thing he learned while running through heat with a wrench in his pocket, that the enemy's truest weapon was the ability to be on time again and again until timing became fate. And with that, his hand stops.